Welcome back for part 2 of the story of the First Fleet. At the end of part 1, the fleet had just left the port at Cape Town for the last leg of the trip to Botany Bay, and there was a whole heap of apprehension and anxiety floating around. Up to this point in the journey, the trip had been smooth sailing in the most literal sense of the term, but as they moved into the southern hemisphere proper, things started to get a bit rough. Fierce winds and what is referred to as the Roaring Forties made things very turbulent, as west to east winds collided at the 40th and 50th degree latitude with the fleet, though it did help to move things along. Some days would be sedate with very little happening on the ocean, while other days were furious and moved the ships along at a great pace. These surges proved costly, for even though the ships might move over 100 miles in a day, at least one seaman was blown off the Prince of Wales and drowned. Supplies began to dwindle, especially the wine. Things were looking grim when the crew of the Friendship spotted Van Diemen's Land, now known as Tasmania, on January 4th. The elation was short-lived, as severe weather damaged some of the ship's mast and sails. On January 16th, Arthur Phillip transferred from the Sirius to Supply, the other of the Navy ships in the fleet. Supply soon joined Alexander, Friendship and Scarborough, the fastest ships in the fleet, in order to look for a suitable landing spot. The intention was to reach the landing point before the other ships in order to locate fresh water and even establish huts before the others arrived. Alas, they were too quick. Supply reached Botany Bay on January 18th, 1788. The next fastest ships arrived on the 19th, with the slowest arriving at the bay on the 20th. It had taken 252 days to get from Portsmouth to Botany Bay, with all ships accounted for and mostly intact, if a bit worse for wear, and only a 3% mortality rate. The First Fleet reached Australia with an estimated contingent of 1,487 people, ready to launch a new settlement for the British Empire. After discovering Botany Bay in 1770, Captain James Cook had sung its praises as a perfect spot to establish a camp or colony. When Arthur Phillip clapped eyes on the exact same spot, he couldn't figure out what the fuss was about, as most of the features were dried out and there was no sign of useful fresh water. Unfortunately, they had arrived during one of the various killer droughts that Australians struggle with right into the present. Still, they tried to make a go of it and set up camp. However, they quickly discovered that the ground was too hard to farm, and the trees too strong to cut with the axes they had brought. In a fit of typical male mentality, in order to counteract the tool blunting effect of the tree trunks, the decision was made to blast the trees out of the ground. The wood was used to make crude huts for the officers. Contact was made with the local Hiora people, who were baffled and wary of these strange-looking men in funny clothing, but nothing much came of it. Things were looking pretty grim. As the days went on, things only got worse. The Marines tended to get drunk and shirk their duties, and their commander Robert Ross was just as bad and frequently clashed with Arthur Phillip. Phillip was also concerned that the settlement was exposed to attack from Aboriginals and foreigners in their current location. Phillip was pretty upset, but still optimistic, and decided to take a look up further to see if there was a better spot, and lo and behold, he found it. On January 21st, Arthur Phillip and a small party that included John Hunter, who was the commander of the Sirius, discovered a spot that is now known as Port Jackson, a spot Cook had overlooked, believing it led to nowhere. Phillip was elated at the find, and the party returned to Botany Bay on the 23rd of January to get things moving. There was a moment of angst when a French ship was discovered near the settlement. They were unaware that it was a scientific expedition led by Jean-Francois de la Perouse, who had heard that the English had established a colony in Botany Bay, but wasn't expecting such a shoddy and ill-prepared operation. The French ship would remain until March 10th, and then disappear, only to be discovered shipwrecked in the Solomon Islands. On January 26th, the fleet weighed anchor and sailed the 12 kilometres north to Port Jackson. The spot where the fleet stopped was named Sydney Cove by Phillip in honour of Lord Sydney, the British Home Secretary. The British flag was planted at 3 p.m. that day by Phillip and some of the crew of Supply, while the others watched from the ship. They cut down a small tree to use as a flagpole. This was the moment the British officially invaded Australia and took possession of a land that was home to hundreds of nations of indigenous people that had lived there for tens of thousands of years. Times were unbelievably tough for the settlement. The convicts were rowdy, the Marines guarding them were worse, and most of the people tasked with establishing an agricultural community had no knowledge of agriculture. The culmination of these factors does not a great colony create. In a missive written by the chief surgeon from the Lady Penrhyn, Arthur Bowes Smythe, he describes Arthur Phillip giving the convicts a grilling and also describes the severity of punishment for even the most trifling of offences. In England, thieving poultry was not punished with death, but here, where a loss of that kind could not be supplied, it was of the utmost consequence to the settlement, as well as every other species of stock, as they were preserved for breeding. Therefore stealing the most trifling article of stock or provisions would be punished with death. Another settler, William Bradley, in his journal of October 1788, describes the awful state of affairs for the farms. The stock brought to Port Jackson has turned to little account. The sheep nearly all dead, the bull and cows missing, either killed by the natives or run wild in the woods. Hogs, which appear to thrive the best, will be lost for want of food, before grain can be raised for their support. The cabbage tree affords good food while it lasts, but there's a great difficulty in getting it. All kinds of poultry thrive very well, and goats particularly well. The great want is grain to support the stock. Amazingly, the worst was yet to come. Contact between the colonists and the local Eora and Cadigal people quickly went south due to the inability of the colonists to comprehend the indigenous language and customs, and vice versa. Arthur Phillip had encouraged his people to be kind to the Aboriginals, as the Privy Council had suggested to him. However, this message largely fell on deaf ears. No treaties were signed with the indigenous population, and as the Europeans spread, they decimated portions of the environment. On top of that, the English brought something far worse than foreign livestock, crops and customs. They brought smallpox. Thousands of indigenous men, women and children died in the first months of English occupancy due to this horrific disease. Watkin Tench, who had travelled on the Charlotte with the fleet, in his records of those early days made note of the bodies floating in the bay and strewn on the rocks near the settlement. In order to establish a good relationship with the Aboriginal peoples, Arthur Phillip decided his best bet was to use the English methodology of kidnapping a native and holding them as a hostage until he agreed to act as an interpreter. Enter Bennelong. Bennelong was a member of the Wongal, who lived in the area now known as Parramatta. On the fateful day in 1789, Arthur Phillip sent redcoats to capture two of the Eora men, and they returned with Bennelong and Colby. Phillip was determined to learn the language of the Eora from these men. However, Colby did a runner, leaving only Bennelong, who quickly learned the lingo and became quite a fixture in the colony. Phillip had clothes made for Bennelong and did all he could to learn from the man about the way the Aboriginals in the area lived and behaved. After a while, Bennelong managed to convince his guards to remove his shackles on his feet. After they obliged, he managed to get the guard to take him outside, whereupon he escaped, removing his clothes and returning to his people naked as the day he was born. Arthur Phillip was naturally pretty upset when he discovered the escape. He let it slide for a while, but during a whale hunting festival sought Bennelong out. For his trouble, he received a spear through his collarbone as payback for what he and the settlers had done to the area and the first people living there. Phillip let that slide too, having come to the conclusion that he must have overstepped a boundary. We invaded their land, destroyed chunks of their habitats, and in some cases have set about killing off rather a few of them. I'm not sure why, but something tells me we may have crossed the line somewhere. Oh yes, there's that. In time, Bennelong reunited with Arthur Phillip, and they were total BFFs again. Bennelong accompanied Phillip back to England, where he attained celebrity status. But as with all people that get famous very quickly and out of nowhere, the novelty wore off for the London elite, and after 3 years abroad, Bennelong returned home and cast aside the trappings of the whitefellas lifestyle to get back to basics and live a life he found fulfilling. When he died, the papers referred to him as an ungrateful savage for turning his back on civilized living. The 8-month journey to Australia was grueling. The conditions on the ships appalling, and the treatment of the prisoners often horrific. Men, women and children suffered the fate of being permanently torn from their homes and families and dumped at the far reaches of the earth without hope of a return. When they arrived in the new land, they decimated chunks of the area for farming and housing, alienated the indigenous population, and either knowingly or unknowingly wiped out thousands of Aboriginals with smallpox when they weren't shooting them to death. They were unskilled farmers who ended up on the brink of starvation due to their inability to satisfactorily grow crops and tend livestock, and due to their ignorance, kicked off a frontier war that would rage for years without a clear winner come the ceasefire. Arthur Phillip eventually returned to England, but kept in touch with his chums in New South Wales. His successes would leave a much more indelible mark on the nation. But most importantly, for the toffs back in England at least, there was now somewhere to dump the excess convicts to ease the prisons. And in the end, isn't relocating the problem better than actually addressing it? So next Australia Day, when you do Sam Kekovich a favour, eat some lamb, and guzzle beer like it's going out of fashion, remember what that day really means. There's a reason so many now call it Invasion Day. Well, thank you for making it all the way to the end of my two-parter on the First Fleet. I didn't include all the information there is to include, as this is just a quick guide, but there's a lot of great resources out there if you want to learn more. I look forward to making more videos like this, and hopefully I'll see you back here when I do. Please like if you enjoyed this video or found it useful, and subscribe to get notified when I have new videos up. If you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments below. Once again, thank you for watching.